Good morning, and welcome to the Adult Ed Forum. We are so grateful this day that we have our Old Church Book author with us today. Just a few words about our author, Mr. Travis Zimmerman. Travis is from the Grand Clans of the Grand Portage bands of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Travis is a veteran of the United States Army and the National Guard. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from St. John University in Collegeville, Minnesota, which some of us had the privilege and the joy to see the firing of the kiln, one of the biggest kilns in the area that happens every couple of years. Travis has been involved in the American Indian organizations in Minnesota and in the regions for almost 30 years, serving as a staff members and board members of dozens of organizations. Travis is currently the site manager of the Mille Lacs Indian Museum, which is part of the Minnesota Historical Society, where he has been employed for over 15 years. We're so grateful that you're here with us today and looking forward to what you had to share with us and also the chance to ask questions and receive your wisdom. Travis, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. So just a little bit about me. Like the pastor mentioned, my dad is an enrolled member of the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, up on the northwest, the Arrowhead region, as it's called. And I'm from the Crane clan, so I grew up in central Minnesota. I was born in Two Harbors, up on the North Shore, and actually spent my time growing up in Melrose. That's where my dad ended up getting a teaching job and was there until he retired. And so I grew up in central Minnesota, entered the military when I was 18 out of high school, served a couple years in the U.S. Army, came out and was part of the Minnesota National Guard, and then attended St. John's University in Collegeville. While I was there, I got a degree in history, and I worked in St. Cloud for a number of years after my college experience. Worked for the Boys and Girls Club and in St. Cloud, and then actually developed and started the first Boys and Girls Club on Indian Reservation in Minnesota on the Mille Lacs Reservation in 1997. And so I was executive director of the Boys and Girls Club there for about 3 or 4 years, and then I moved down to the Twin Cities and worked at a number of different organizations. I worked at the Division of Indian Works, the Minnesota American Indian Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota American Indian OIC, and during that time I also was the chair of it's called the MUD Group, the Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors. I was also the chair for a while, for a number of years, chairman of the board for the Minneapolis American Indian Center. So, and then I started working at the Minnesota Historical Society about 15 years ago. So I finally found out what I wanted to do when I grew up. And it was interesting because I had never used my history degree before. And I often wondered, what do you do with a history degree? Do you teach, you write books? I mean, and so connecting with the Minnesota Historical Society has been great. I originally started working at St. Paul in the History Center because that's the headquarters for the Minnesota Historic Society. And I started as I started working with, they have an American Indian Advisory Committee that's been going on since 1987, where they invited each band from the state to select a representative to sit on a committee that advises the Minnesota Historical Society on everything from books they publish, programs they run, Indian collections, archaeology, education materials, pretty much anything doing with American Indians is what that advisory committee advises them on. And so I worked in St. Paul for about 1.5 years, and then they asked me if I wanted to go up and manage the Mille Lacs Indian Museum. So when I went up and took that position, they made me the Indian Affairs liaison for the Minnesota Historic Society. So I not only ran the historic site, the Mille Lacs Indian Museum, but I was still working with the American Indian Advisory Committee for a number of years. And I think it was 7 or 8 years total that I held that kind of dual position. And then now I am just the site manager of the Mille Lacs Indian Museum. So if you've never been up there, we're one of 26 historic sites throughout the state of Minnesota. And we tell the story primarily of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, but we also tell the exhibits talk about the history and culture of Ojibwe in general. And we also have a great trading post there that we work with Native artists and buy and sell handcrafted American Indian items. So, how did I get here? What am I doing here today? So, it's been a couple months now. Bonnie came up, Bonnie Mellon came up with a book club group that she was with, and asked if, they came to tour the museum, and then asked, would there be somebody available to kind of just talk with them, answer questions that they had about the book being the same one that you all are reading, the Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. And so we had a great conversation. We sat and met for a couple hours, and just talked about kind of anything and everything. So then she followed up and said, we really enjoyed our visit, and would you be willing to come and talk to the church group that's involved with the One Read? So, and I didn't really want to talk just about the book, and so the presentation that I'm going to be talking about today and looking at and doing, it's I called it, How Do You Terminate a Group of People and the American Indian Experience in the 20th Century. Because I think as a historian, what I often find out is that history doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? I mean, there's all these precursing type of events that lead up to certain things, and then there's always fallout from other things, And so I wanted to take a look, stretching over the whole, kind of 20th century, and looking at what were some of the significant, federal legislation, events, things that happened that really had an impact on Indian communities. And so, I'm going to take you through 100 years of Indian history here real quick. So I'm probably not going to do anything a whole lot of justice, but I do think it's important that you look at kind of what happened leading up to, because this book was written in the 50s, the time of the Termination era. And so, there is some themes that I'm going to be touching on that, are relevant throughout the book and connect to the book here. So let's see if I know what I'm doing here. So I kind of, thought, how do I talk about 100 years in history? So I just broke it up into chunks of 25 years. It seemed easy enough, and by no means is what I'm going to talk about the breadth of what happened or, everything that you need to know about American Indians in the 20th century. But I tried to pull out kind of key themes, events, like I said, legislation, and, just thought I would share a little bit and talk about that. And then, of course, at the end, I do want to have time available to answer any questions that you might have. So this first section here, 1900 to 1925, basically boarding schools. You had the boarding school era that started in the 1800s, late 1800s, that was still very prevalent at the beginning of the 20th century. You had World War I, which was, of course, a major event for the world. And then you had the American Indian Citizenship Act. So to start with boarding schools. In America, there was over 350 boarding schools in the United States. And the Carlisle Indian Boarding School was primarily one of the first boarding schools and it was run by a military officer, and his whole thing was, the policy was, kill the Indian, save the man. So it was really about, how do we assimilate American Indians? How do we basically strip them of everything that makes them American Indian, and have them be part of the American society? These boarding schools were federally operated. There were also a lot of boarding schools that were run by churches and religious sects. And these, a lot of children were forced to attend. They would go around reservations and basically round up Indian kids and take them to these boarding schools. At its height, over 80% of the Indian children, representing hundreds of thousands of children, attended boarding schools, and that was by the 1930s, was pretty much the height of the boarding schools. And there was actually 16 of these schools operating in Minnesota. And recently I found out that St. John's and St. Ben's University had a number of those schools. There was one in Red Lake Reservation, there was one on the White Earth Reservation, but also where their campuses currently are, they had schools for Indian girls and Indian boys. And so I just recently got asked to sit on a Native Nations task force that the president of the universities there has put together to try to repair some of the harm that was done by those schools, but also just to dig a little deeper, to look at what those schools were, but also to look at how do we make St. John's and St. Ben's a more welcoming community for Native students, is kind of one of our goals too. I just want to say one thing about boarding schools is that a lot of times these children were taken, and it's not like they were day schools. It's not like they were coming home at the end of the day. A lot of these schools were, great distance from the reservations. And so these children were gone all year. And so just think about the impact that would have on a community that's void of children. And if you listen to some of the stories of not only the people that attended the boarding schools, but the parents of children that attended the boarding schools, it's just heartbreaking, because I remember reading one elder saying it was just so quiet. There was no kids laughing or running or screaming or crying. It was just, suddenly it was just quiet. There was nothing. But think about what that does for parenting skills. If you have a couple generations of people that are no longer parenting children, right? And as parents, a lot of times we reach out to our parents, right, to help us out. I was a young parent, and I know that my mom was there right away, my first child, right? I didn't know what to do. We brought the baby home. We're looking at it in the crib, me and my wife going, oh, it's crying. What do we need to do here? But my mom was there. And but just, that kind of, that break in parenting. But then also these children, when they came home, no longer spoke the language. They no longer knew the ceremonies. They no longer knew the customs and the protocols, right? And so there's already a generational gap that we see, right, as human beings, between the older generation and the younger generation. But just think about how that really tore the community apart. First of all, being void of children, and then when they do come back, no relation, not being able to relate to their parents and their grandparents, their aunts and uncles. So I wanted to, because I think that's, I don't think we really look at how damaging boarding schools were. People say, oh, boarding schools, but I think it's probably one of the most detrimental things that happened to American Indians. Also in this quarter of the first quarter of the 20th century, we had World War I, where more than 12,000 American Indians served in World War I. And what's interesting about that is they weren't even citizens yet. American Indians weren't even technically citizens. Some of them were if they paid taxes, if they owned land, but very few were. But yet 12,000 joined the effort to fight in World War I. The first code talkers were introduced in World War I. They used their native languages to transmit messages. The Comanche were the first tribe that they started with the code talkers. But there was also Dakota and Ojibwe from Minnesota that were code talkers in both World Wars. And they spoke their, basically just by speaking their languages to transmit messages, they couldn't be broken by the enemy forces. And then following the end of the war in 1919, American Indians who served in the war were granted citizenship. And then in 1924 was American Indian Citizenship Act that gave citizen rights to all American Indians born in the United States. Like I had mentioned, about half of the 300,000 American Indians were citizens by that time because of not only the war, but if they were allotted land and were paying taxes, they already were considered citizens. But the one thing that this didn't do is that a lot of them still couldn't vote because of state and local ordinances. And a lot of American Indians actually didn't get that right to vote until the late 40s and 50s. So the second half here of the 20th century, or the second quarter, couple things: the Miriam Report, the Indian Reorganization Act, or what was also known as the IRA, and of course, World War II. Every generation has its war, right? So the Miriam Report was interesting. It was published in 1928, and it surveyed conditions on American Indian reservations in 26 different states. And what the Miriam Report found was that American Indians were living in poverty, that they had very high rates of disease, they didn't live very long, and a lot of this they found out was due to the loss of land. And the biggest loss of land, so to think about it, you got to go back into even the 19th century, right? Because the major thing that happened at the end of the 19th century was the Dawes Act, or it was also known as the General Allotment Act, where it basically every Indian was assigned a number of acres, a plot of land. After they divvied up all the land to all the American Indians that could be landholders, there was all this surplus land. And of course, that surplus land went back to the United States, which they opened up and sold to non-Indian people. So it was really, wasn't so much about giving American Indians their individual allotments, it was more about trying to get Indian land. And because of the Allotment Act, over 90 million acres of Indian land was lost from 1887 until they ended the allotment era in the 1930s. And for a people that subsist on land, you know, that land is their primary resource, and to have such a strong connection to land, it was really detrimental. And part of the things too is that American Indians didn't have the same concept of ownership. So a lot of them didn't really understand owning land. A lot of them were actually swindled out of their land by timber companies and different things, you know, because they signed their deeds away. And a lot of those deeds they found out just had X marks by them or thumbprints on them. And it's very likely they didn't even know what they were signing. These findings also included a lot about boarding schools and about the abuses that were going on, about the number of children that would die at these boarding schools. And a lot of that was because of disease, right? Tuberculosis was a big thing that killed a lot of Indian children, well, killed a lot of children, you know, in the early 20th century, but a lot of Indian children died at these boarding schools and never made it home. So with the Miriam Report was really kind of the catalyst for the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. This Reorganization Act was dubbed the Indian New Deal. Its goal was to reverse the cultural assimilation and to try to address some of the issues that were brought up in the Miriam Report. It basically ended the Allotment Act of Indian lands and put reservation land back in trust. gave tribes subsidies to develop their own constitutions, and out of that, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe was formed. So the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, if you're not familiar, is an umbrella organization that all of the Ojibwe reservations in Minnesota belong to except Red Lake. So it's the other 6 reservations, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, Bois Fort, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Mille Lacs. So they fall under the umbrella organization, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And the Indian Reorganization Act also allowed tribes to develop businesses and establish credit systems with the federal government. The reason I mentioned the Minnesota Chippewa tribe is because that's something that's relevant today, because the Constitution for the Minnesota Chippewa tribe was formed in 1934 under the IRA. Well, now a lot of these same tribe bands that belong to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe are looking currently at their membership. So American Indian tribes can define their own membership. And a lot of them go by what the federal government recognizes as being American Indian, which is 25% or 1/4 Indian blood. For the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, it's 1/4 Minnesota Chippewa tribe blood. So you have to have 1/4, right, blood quantum of one of those 6 bands, or a combination of those 6 bands. So they don't take any other Indian blood into consideration. And what's interesting about that is, what other group of people do you know that are defined by their blood quantum, right? And for American Indians, over and over and over, you get asked the question when you say you're American Indian, how much? Has anybody ever asked any of your African American friends or Asian American or Latino friends, how much are you, right? But for American Indians, it's like we need to somehow define our blood. You know, that's for animals, right? Purebreds, quantum, blood quantum, right, is for thoroughbred, for horses, for, you know, I mean, it's the only group of people that gets assigned to. And so, because a lot of these tribes now, so I mentioned I'm from Grand Portage, that's a very small band. There's maybe over 1,000 members. Well, they're looking at it, they're saying within 50 years, unless those band members are intermarrying Minnesota Chippewa tribe members to keep that blood going within the Minnesota, there's not going to be a Grand Portage band anymore. And so it's really a time in our history that a lot of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe bands are now trying to go away from the IRA model and this Constitution and define their own membership. And so it's going to be interesting to see in the next few years here what happens. And then, of course, World War II broke out. Over 25,000 American Indians served in World War II. This represented, at the time, 1/3 of all able-bodied men, 18 to 50, of American Indians. And so American Indians have historically served at a higher rate than in the military than any other ethnic group in America. And World War II was no different. By 1985, it's estimated that American Indians purchased over $50 million in war bonds, and this should be war bonds, sorry. My spell check didn't catch that, bands, war bonds and stamps, which for people that didn't have much, right, for them to spend that much money and in war bonds and stamps. But part of it was they got better pay when they're in the military, so they supported the war effort. But then also it led to this major urban migration because there was a lot of jobs opened up in factories. So a lot of wartime jobs opened up that a lot of Indians left the reservation, started working in the cities, were paying, you know, where there was high unemployment rates on the reservation, they were able to work, and so they were using that money to raise money for the war. As almost 50,000 Indians left the reservation. And then the Navajo code talkers, I had mentioned the code talkers came about in World War I, really are credited with helping win the war in the Pacific. Because not only did the Navajo, how I mentioned other tribes would transmit messages in their language, the Navajo actually created a whole code around it. So even if you knew how to speak Navajo, you would not have known what they were transmitting in their language. 1951 to 1975, termination and relocation, red power, and self-determination. So termination and relocation, of course, that was a big theme in the book, right? That Thomas was fighting. It's interesting because I remember that one part where he's saying, terminate, and then he said, add a EX in front of it, exterminate, right? Well, if you look at the policy of the 19th century, that was pretty much the policy towards American Indians. I mean, you had General Sheridan say the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? That was kind of the thought. You basically had the war against the Plain Indians where they, in order to subdue them, they killed all the buffalo, killed hundreds of millions of buffalo, because that was the main food source. That's what they used for their teepees. That's what they used for their clothing. It was, everything. And they exterminated the buffalo to subdue the Plains tribes. And so it really was a policy of extermination. And many people, and I think rightfully so, would say what happened to the American Indians was genocide. So the House Concurrent Resolution 108, which also was known as the Indian Termination Act, in effect terminated 109 tribes, right? In the book, they were successful in not getting in Turtle Mountain not being terminated, but 109 tribes weren't so fortunate, and that affected the tribal enrollment of over 12,000 Indians. But again, this was about land. This thing that keeps coming up is it's always about land. It's always about land, and it's always about money, the policies that affect American Indians. Another 2.5 million acres of land were taken out of protected status and sold to non-Indians. And then going along with the termination was this policy of relocation, saying, well, let's relocate Indians into the cities. They designated many cities as relocation destinations, and they offered vocational training. We'll set you up, we'll give you money to get you on your feet, give you your first month's rent, that kind of thing, get you a bus ticket, try to help you find a job, sent them to the cities, and ultimately that too failed. There was not a lot of follow-up, there was not a lot of support in the cities. When they tried to get jobs, of course, there was discrimination and racism that played a role. And so it ended up creating these large urban populations with high unemployment rates and Indians living in poverty in the cities. Born out of this, though, because you had this shift to urban American Indian population, was the Red Power movement during the 1960s. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in Minneapolis in 1968. One of the founders, unfortunately, just passed away here a couple weeks ago, Clyde Bellecourt. The Indians of all tribes took over Alcatraz Island in 1969 and occupied it for 19 months. The Trail of Broken Treaties converges on Washington, D.C. in 1972 to address unkept promises. And their goal was to meet with Nixon, but they never got the chance to. And then AIM took over Wounded Knee for 71 days in 1973 to address conditions of the American Indians and corruptions on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Again, one of the things that was happening that not a lot of people know that was behind Wounded Knee was that the tribal government there was leasing out lands, and the United States was strip mining for uranium. And that was also another thing behind the whole termination and relocation policy, was to get that land, because when they first when Indians held on to their reservations, right, they didn't know there was uranium on Indian land, but once they started developing nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, they found out that over 60% of all the uranium in the United States was on Indian land. So once again, it became a push on how do we get this land. And that was one of the behind-the-scenes factors of the takeover of Wounded Knee, because when you strip mine uranium, they had astronomical rates of cancer going on because that fallout, they weren't doing it, ethically. And you had really high cancer rates, children being deformed, a lot of people dying on the reservation as a result. After Red Power, you had this era of self-determination. In 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed, which granted provisions of the Bill of Rights to tribal people. 1975, the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act was passed. And, for all the slack that Nixon gets, he was probably actually one of the most proactive presidents for American Indians. During his time in office, he did more to kind of end the termination era and really say, hey, Indian people should be able to take over their own, help themselves and help pass the Self-Determination Education Act, which let tribes take greater control, but also tribes were then allowed to develop their own schools on reservations after that. So the last quarter here, religious freedom, NAGPRA, gaming, and treaty rights. So I'm going to just finish up here and then see if there's any questions either in the audience here or online. So religious freedom, you had the Indian Religious Freedom Act passed in 1978. So that ended 300 years of persecution that tribes could not practice their own religion. So think about that, and everything else that I talked about, then not even being able to worship, the way you wanted to. And so, but tribes were, after 1978, were allowed to not only practice their religion, their customs, and their ceremonies. They were allowed access to sacred sites, many of which were on federal land. A lot of them were part of like national parks or held by the Federal Bureau of Land Management, things like that. And it was no longer illegal to use and possess sacred objects. In 1988, you had the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which basically allowed Indians to, it was passed to promote economic development on reservations through gaming. And so it established the National Indian Gaming Association, which regulated gaming and gambling on Indian reservations. As a result, the Minnesota Indian Gaming Association was also founded at about that same time in 1987, actually a year prior. And that was to support the tribes in Minnesota with their enterprises. And currently today, Minnesota tribes operate 19 casinos throughout the state, which has, if you look at a lot of the tribes, it's, it's good or bad. I mean, obviously you have the Shakopee tribe here, right? The Shakopee and Winnewakanton Sioux community. Their casino has done very well and has provided, for their members. And then other ones, like you get up on Red Lake, White Earth, some of those, and basically they're kind of more employment centers than anything because they're so far removed from any major population area that they don't really make that much money. Also during this quarter, you had the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so that was an act to repatriate not only the cultural remains, but also the biological remains of American Indians. You had a lot of museums that still had human remains, had American Indian skulls and bones and body parts sitting in their collections, some of them even on display. And so this allowed for those remains to be returned to the tribes that would then reinterm them and bury them. And this affected primary federally funded institutions could no longer house human remains, right? A lot of people still have human remains in their personal collections or if they're not federally funded. It also provided protection for Indian graves and burial sites because for years and years, hundreds of years, people would rob graves, would dig into mounds, right? The St. Paul mounds for years, archaeologists have dug in there and taken out objects and sell them. They're worth lots of money and stuff. And so that allowed for protection of the burial sites. And then also there was a way for tribes that they could try to repatriate objects of cultural significance. And then treaty rights. There was a lot that happened around treaty rights in the last quarter of the 20th century, but the three major decisions were the Bolt decision in Washington State, which allowed tribes to fish in traditional places and allocated 50% of the annual harvest to treaty tribes. The Voigt decision in Wisconsin, and if you know of anything of that, in 1980, the hunting and fishing rights there got very nasty. You had people out there protesting Indians be able to spear and net, which if you go back, those were all treaty rights, right? So when American Indians gave up the land that became Minnesota and Wisconsin, part of that was that they would be able to hunt and fish, right, on the ceded territories, and that the United States government would provide housing, healthcare, and education. I mean, that was all part of the treaty negotiations because those lands that were given up ended up having mineral rights worth millions and even billions of dollars. And so these hunting and fishing rights weren't special treatment. These were part of the negotiations that we will give you these chunks of land, but we also still are able to subsist on them. And so, I mean, there was people in Wisconsin, holding signs saying, save a walleye, kill an Indian, save 2 walleye, kill a pregnant squaw. I mean, it really got nasty. They would fire shots over the heads of people that were practicing their treaty rights. Then Minnesota went through theirs. It didn't get as nasty, but it was still, even to today, up around Mille Lacs is a very, fishing rights is a very controversial issue. But in 1999, the Supreme Court upheld the hunting and fishing rights of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, which then set a precedence for a lot of the other bands that they didn't have to go through that fight. And then I just quickly wanted to mention some of the things in the first quarter of the 21st century so far, right? You have the Idle No More movement that really started in Canada, but basically was Indians getting together, was kind of a new Red Power era, saying, we're not going to stand by anymore, we're going to fight for our rights. Out of that movement was really, I think, came what happened at Standing Rock, right, a number of years ago. And again, that was about land. It was about where were they putting pipelines, right through Indian reservations. I think something that's helping American Indians now in the 21st century is Native representation. And not just Native representation in, pop culture. You have more Indian writing books. You have Yellowstone, one of the number one, watched series in television, has a large population of Indian in their casting. You have Indians, being involved in the writing of those stories, but also Native representation as far as elected officials. I mean, right now, Peggy Flanagan, right, is a lieutenant governor, state of Minnesota. So Deb Haaland is the highest ranking official as a head of the Department of Interior on the national level. So you are seeing a lot more American Indians involved in the political system. More and more people are starting to do land acknowledgements and starting to realize, hey, the land we sit on, is Indian land. I mean, it's all Indian land. It all was Indian land at one time, which has also led to a movement where a lot of American Indians are looking at land back. How do they get that land back? How do they get the land back that was lost in the allotment era, that was lost during the termination policy, those things. So a lot of tribes are starting to buy land back if they have the resources. Another thing that's come to the forefront recently, and that is, part of the theme of the book also, is the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I mean, Patrice's sister Vera luckily didn't end up murdered, but she was missing. They couldn't find her. Found out she was sex trafficked and ended up an addict. But for years, there was no numbers kept on missing and murdered Indigenous women. There was no national database to track that. And that's something that impacts, I personally know several Indian women that have went missing or have been murdered. And then lastly, Every Child Matters, which is starting to look at the boarding schools, especially in Canada. They've been finding these mass graves of hundreds of children. And it's just a matter of time, I think, before that starts happening in the United States, that they start looking at what was the true cost of boarding schools in the United States. So with that, I'll leave you with my contact information, but it looks like we still got about 15 more minutes or so. So I'd be open to take any questions that people have. And I know that was real quick. Synopsis of 100-year history, but yeah, so I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. We do have about 75 households watching online, so I've got a number of questions already that have come in, and anybody here who has a question, I'm happy to bring the mic over in your direction as well. Several people sent their welcome, thanks for being here with us. Vivian asked, Mr. Zimmerman, please speak to the discrimination towards American Indian GIs after World War II, in particular the money for building homes.
Well, I'm not sure specifically what she's referring to about the money to build homes, but, a lot of American Indians were discriminated against. I mean, I don't think it's something that's in the past. I think there's still a certain amount of discrimination even today. Before the presentation, me and you were talking about border towns, how border towns, bordering reservations are some of the most, problematic places in America, because you really have this racial tension in these towns, and you have a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism. But yeah, people that came back and served couldn't find jobs, right? They had served their country, but there were still some places that wouldn't let them Indians in their establishments. There was signs on certain businesses that said no Indians and no dogs allowed. I mean, so you go and you fight for your country, but you're still not, when you come back, considered a citizen and able to work in certain things. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what she's asking about the housing. I guess I'm that's something I'm not familiar with. But there was a lot of housing discrimination. I know that when I was in St. Cloud for a number of years, I sat on the Human Rights Commission for St. Cloud, and this was in the 90s after I graduated college. And we actually did a thing where we would go and send people out to rent from landlords, and we would send African American couple or American Indian couple or a Mexican couple, and it was surprising to see how many times they were told, we don't have any units available, and then we would send in a white couple or a white person, and they would rent them the unit, right? And that was in the 90s. So, housing discrimination has been going on for a long time. One of the things they did to address that in Minneapolis was the American Indian movement was actually behind that in the 70s. And they started the Little Earth housing complex, Little Earth of United Tribes housing complex. And that's, one of the largest housing complexes that houses American Indians in the whole nation right now. So, that's one thing that American Indians have done to combat some of that is to, take control and find their own housing for their own people and control that.
Another question, maybe a little bit more locally oriented. Why was Turtle Mountain successful in avoiding termination?
Well, I think it comes down to some of the tribes. The House Concurrent Bill surprisingly didn't have a lot of debate in Congress. There wasn't a lot of hoopla during the time about it, right? There was very little talked about. So I think the fact that they kind of rallied around it, sent delegations, talked to their elected officials, that sort of thing, I think that's what got results. And a lot of tribes, and even that, if you look at the book, it's like Thomas kind of just happened upon that, right? And he sits on the advisory committee or the tribal council, and it's not like it was really put out there, and that a lot of tribes knew that they were even up for termination. So, there's a lot of things that happen in Congress kind of 12th hour, right? And they put these bills through and stuff that, not a lot of the common folk really know about. So I think that's probably what saved most of the tribes is that if, they knew about it and they were able to make a stand against it, and especially if they could make a case. Again, I think it was probably more about, I think they targeted certain tribes that had resources that they wanted to. And if these tribes were, kind of on the peripheral and maybe didn't have as many of the resources that were needed or wanted, that maybe that saved them from termination.
There's several more questions online. Anyone in the room have a question? All right.
Travis, when a tribe was terminated, did that mean they lost their government administrative help and all, or what were the consequences when a tribe was terminated?
Yeah, so they basically lost their status as American Indians. So any kind of help that they got through the federal government, right? So on reservations, even though tribes are sovereign nations, they're not really truly sovereign, right? They still have a lot of help from the federal government. And like I'd mentioned in treaties, that part of that the federal responsibility was to provide housing, healthcare, education. So they lost all that. So when they lost their status as tribes, they lost any federal assistance or any federally funding that came with that. They lost their status as American Indians. So, anything they had negotiated through treaties, hunting and fishing rights, anything like that, they lost. And then, of course, the land bases that they reserved for themselves, their reservations, they also lost. So, so that's why I named my presentation, How Do You Terminate a People? I mean, one minute you're Indian, next minute you're not. It's bizarre.
Thanks. Following up on that, were there tribes in Minnesota that were terminated? Or what's the nearest tribe to us, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Iowa, that was actually terminated at that time?
Yeah, I do not think any tribes in Minnesota were terminated. No. But one interesting thing to note, how I mentioned the Minnesota Chippewa tribe was the umbrella organization for the 6 Ojibwe bands besides Red Lake. One of the things that happened at Red Lake is they stayed a closed reservation. So when I talked about the Dawes Act or the General Allotment Act, Red Lake voted not to accept that. They're one of 2 tribes in the United States that were not affected by the Dawes Act, which meant they kept their reservation intact. and they didn't allot it out. It was Red Lake and the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon are the only two tribes that did not accept the Dawes Act. And that's why they were not part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, because Red Lake's always kind of been looked as a separate entity because of that fact.
Emily is saying, thanks so much for being here. I'm curious if there was any aspect of the book or character that really resonated with you.
Any aspect of the book or character? Yeah, I want to be Wood Mountain. I mean, as a male, I wrestled. I used to, when I ran the Boys and Girls Club on the Mille Lacs Indian Reservation, I actually became the boxing coach, and we had a boxing program. And so, that whole part of the story, just about, the boxing, and then him going and trying to help Patrice, that sort of thing, just kind of resonated with me because, when I worked in different positions in the past in social services, it really was about, when you work in social service, you see a lot of things, and it gets to be kind of a heavy job, but it really does boil down to just trying to help people.
We have a question about if people in attendance today have artifacts in their personal or family collections, who do they contact to return those sacred objects?
So you can start by, you can contact me if you want. A lot of what since I'm part of the Minnesota Historical Society, though, I'll probably direct you to someone that's heads our American Indian collection in St. Paul. They'll look at it. Part of bringing pieces like that into museums is a lot of times the story behind them is just as important as the objects, right? So if they don't have a lot of provenance, like if you really don't know who made it or where it come from, a lot of times museums might not be as interested. Same with tribes. But so actually I'll back up. I'll say the first thing, if you know the tribe it came from, a lot of tribes, especially in Minnesota, now have THPO offices, which are Tribal Historic Preservation Offices. And so I would suggest contacting the tribe, if you know where it came from, to get that object back to the tribe, because it may be something that they're familiar with. It may be something, right, that's a part of their ceremonial life, or something that, might be belong to somebody, that's important. So it might be an important piece of that tribe's culture or lore. So I would say, if you know the tribe, to contact the tribe directly and try to get it back to the tribe. If you don't know, and you just want it in a museum for safekeeping, or whatever type of thing, then I would say, you could contact the Minnesota Historic Society, your local county historical society, that type of thing. But if you do want it returned, to the people it originated with, then I would say go to the tribe directly first.
I know that our live stream audience is going to drop off in just a bit of time here, so I just want to say thanks again to you. And for those of you who are participating in the book read, next week we have discussion groups in the rec room or on Zoom. You can register on Realm for those. So thank you again so much for being
Thanks for
here.
having me.
And I can see the questions have dropped off the feed. So I think that means the live stream audience is not here. Does anyone else in the room have additional questions?